Welcome to the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Vocational Rehabilitation Practices and Youth online seminar series. The center conducts research and provides trainings and technical assistance which investigate problems, craft solutions, and design actionable strategies for translating research into usable, feasible, and effective strategies for transitioning stakeholders, which include VR agencies, policymakers, researchers, transitioning youth and their family, educators, practitioners, and employers. Our online seminars are designed to provide VR counselors and other youth employment stakeholders with short training lessons on a wide variety of topics related to VR practices and youth outcomes. Each seminar is conducted by well-respected content experts. Once you've watched the online seminar, you have the opportunity to take a quiz to show what you've learned. A link to the quiz will appear once the seminar video is completed. If you score 70% or higher on the quiz, you'll be emailed a certificate of completion for your records. If your score is below 70%, you'll have one additional chance to re-watch the seminar and take the quiz. Check out our website at www.vrpracticesandyouth.org and check it out frequently for new seminars, publications, free webinars on topics related to providing effective vocational rehabilitation services to youth and young adults, or to contact us directly with questions. The Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Vocational Rehabilitation Practices and Youth is funded by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Administration on Community Living. Now, on to the seminar.
Welcome to Supporting Students with Intellectual Disability and Autism in Going to College. The roles for families and vocational rehabilitation professionals. And the presenters will be Jennifer Suleski and Deborah Hart from the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Vocational Rehabilitation and Youth at Think College, the Institute for Community Inclusion at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Next slide, please. The major learning objective for today's seminar is for families, or learning how families and vocational rehabilitation professionals can support success of students with intellectual disability and/or autism in pre-college, during high school, then during college, and post-college. Next slide, please. Now we're going to examine what can families in voc rehab do before students enter college while they're in high school. Next slide, please. This video clip really demonstrates how important high expectations are.
When I was younger, I was never told to think about going to college.
I was never really told to think big about much.
But I still wanted to go to college.
Like my sister.
It took a lot of work.
But I made it.
And I'm a student at Bridgewater State University.
At Mass Bay Community College.
At UMass Boston.
To make your dreams come true.
And Think College.
For information about college for people with intellectual disabilities, visit thinkcollege.net.
It really is across all areas. The need for high expectations of students with intellectual challenges is really critical. Perceptions are changing, but many families, students, and professionals are not aware that students with intellectual disabilities and/or autism are going to college. Next slide, please. As this slide is titled, "You Can't Go If You Don't Know," really highlights the need for getting the word out that students with intellectual disabilities are going to college, and that it is somewhat of a movement at this point in time. Next slide, please.
Run to class, grab some lunch, hit the books, catch a bus, work a part-time job, pick up the paycheck, head home or to the dorm. Add to that some time at the gym or at a campus event, and there you have it, a typical day for a college student. To take on and manage this kind of schedule, some college students, including those with intellectual disabilities, work with a mentor or coach. Before the semester begins, they make a plan, mapping out the schedule for the semester. They also determine what tasks or activities the student can do independently and which ones will require some support. Students may need some support using transportation, getting around the campus, communicating with course instructors, meeting with an advisor, getting accommodations, accessing academic support services, taking advantage of free time, participating in campus activities, making social connections, or managing a schedule. Ideally, these supports are invisible to most people on campus. For those that are more obvious, the goal is to make it clear that they are directed by the student. Whether they play an obvious role or stay in the background, coaches and mentors help college students take responsibility for themselves and their education.
The prior video clip really explains the day in the life of a student with intellectual disabilities at college. It's really no different from any other college student, with the exception of coaches and or mentors as wraparound supports to ensure that the student meets with success. Now, we're looking at the growth of higher education programs for students with intellectual disability in this country, really starting in 2008. There are approximately 268 programs. That number changes from day to day. Some programs actually stop operating. For the most part, it's a pretty steady group of individuals, in the incline, as you can see, of programs has been consistent. And the increase around 2009, 2008 was due to the passage of the Higher Education Act in 2008. Next slide, please. The Higher Education Act really had in it three key areas that are relevant to students with intellectual disabilities for the very first time. There was the model demonstration programs, which are transition and post-secondary programs for students with intellectual disability, or the acronym is called TIPSIDs. They also had provisions for a national coordinating center. The coordinating center is charged with providing technical assistance, coordination, and evaluation of these TIPSID projects, or model demonstration projects, and to really provide assistance to other non-TIPSID post-secondary education programs who want to enhance what they've been doing or to start a program in any geographic area, especially where there's very little activity. The other key component in the Higher Ed Act was eligibility for federal student aid, Pell Grants, federal supplemental educational opportunity grants, and work-study jobs for students with intellectual disabilities. This is the first time students with intellectual disabilities were eligible for federal student aid. And there is a process and a whole criteria that is on the thinkcollege.net website, where you can get much more information. Next slide, please. This is a link to the seminar that talks a lot of more detail about the Higher Ed Opportunities Act and the model demonstration program. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to give you some tools that may help you in working with your child or student to better prepare for college. This is conducting a college search. It's a database of those 268 post-secondary education programs. And this is a tool that I'll have a list of all these tools that I'm going to review with you at the end of this seminar with links to the exact tool. This one has questions to ask college programs, like what's the size, how many students, do you have a credential, what is it in, what are the tuition and fees, and most importantly, what are the outcomes of the students who participate? Are they in integrated paid employment when they exit? As an example. Next slide, please. Some tips to get more information. I would really recommend for any of the programs listed that you conduct a phone call to ask additional questions. Consider you and the student actually going through the typical orientation session so you can get a sense of what the college campus has to offer and meet some students and faculty and have a conversation around, especially with students, of what their experiences have been. And you also might want to visit the Disability Services Office to see how connected it is to the program. And you might also lastly want to collect with alumni and their families, again, to learn about their experience at the college and what they're doing now in terms of outcomes. Next slide, please. Okay, our partners at the Pacer Center in Minnesota developed this insight brief, and they interviewed 5 parent leaders across the country, and they really identified a change model and made some suggestions. Next slide, please. Here are some of the tips on growing post-secondary education options, because unfortunately at this point in time, the majority of states, other than the West Coast, California specifically, and the East Coast, the majority of states in between have very little activity or options for going to college. And they really recommend don't do it alone. Really reaching out to other family members or professionals who might be interested in trying to grow this as an option. Contacting the University Center of Excellence in Developmental Disabilities to help identify and connect with other partners. And most University Centers of Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, or UCEDs, are within an institute of higher education, so that might be the partner right there. And really try to create awareness, get the word out that this is a movement, and get people excited about it. Next slide, please. This is the process for change that a number of folks actually now have used, but this is what they were recommending, the Deborah Lukovius and Sean Roy. And I'm not going to go through each of these 8 areas because the insight brief covers that, but they looked at John Cotter and his model for change. The book is called Leading Change, and it's 8 steps to build inclusive higher education programs, or it actually can be used to develop a program for one student if one is interested. I know one of the parents that were interviewed for this actually did all these steps to create a college option for her son. And it was amazing to see. I don't think she was consciously following this a process for change, but she did go through each one of these areas. Also, the University of Central Florida has used this model to develop a program. So it seems to fit quite well. And I would encourage you, if you're a family member looking to develop options for your student with an intellectual disabilities, you might really want to look at this. Next slide, please. These are foundational skills for college and career success. I'd like to add that these are not just for students with disabilities or intellectual disabilities. I've done some research, and we looked at cross-discipline content of what was available for soft skills that were deemed important. And we found some research that was done of community college students, because they were looking at why were students not completing and just dropping out. And the 4 areas that they identified were balance of multiple roles, academic and career habits, cultural know-how, and self-direction were the key areas that students were lacked skills in. And on the right-hand side, you see a subset of skills or characteristics, if you will, that students have to have. And I think it's important that family members realize these soft skills that can make or break all aspects of adult life, and how important it is to teach your family member these skills. And these are not just for students with intellectual disabilities. I mean, some of the areas, if you look at self-direction, communication needs, advocates for own needs, manages personal finances, accesses healthcare. These are all critical things that students can learn before they even enter college. And it can happen while they're at home, not necessarily in high school. That can reinforce some of these skills too. Next slide, please. And here's a sample foundational skills for college and career learning plan. This is something a student can use. There's 3 steps to this. The first step is that students review the skills in each of the 4 areas and identify 1 to 4 skills that they want to work on. Now, they can do this with a coach or a mentor, and then they develop the learning plan that documents what the skill is, where they're going to practice it, and how often they're going to practice it. The third step is really developing a schedule that the student and mentor review how the student is doing in learning, how they think they're doing in learning a particular skill, or and how the mentor is viewing and what the data they have on this. Again, there'll be a link at the end where you can just link to this on the website. Next slide, please. Jen?
Okay, this is where I pick up for a few minutes. I'm just going to provide just a little bit of background on where the information that I'm talking, what my role is in this presentation and where the information that I'm talking about comes from. I've been leading a project where we're doing case studies of 4 college programs for students with intellectual disabilities and or autism across the country, where they're known to have a really good track record of collaboration with the local VR entity. And so based on talking to people at those local VR agencies and at the colleges, we've come up with some guidance for what some of the roles are that VR counselors and supervisors and even state agencies can play in supporting students with intellectual disabilities to access and succeed in college. And so I'm going to talk right now just about some of the things we heard about good roles for VR, especially VR counselors, to play before a student goes to college. And the same as what Deborah's been saying for parents, having high expectations is an important role for the VR counselor as well. We talked to people who had had varied experiences with their vocational rehabilitation counseling, ranging from the counselors who were honestly very discouraging to ones that were really encouraging and really opened their eyes to some of the options. So having those expectations, being aware that students with intellectual disabilities do have options to access college and encouraging students is really an important role for VR. And a few ways that counselors can feel better prepared to do that are to learn a little bit more about, well, first about how supporting higher education can help VR agencies to meet their required performance measures, especially under the new common performance measures under the WIOA. There's more emphasis on skill building and obtaining credentials, and connecting students with higher education programs can really help to meet those performance measures. If you want to find out more about that, my colleague Russ Talene and I did another one of these seminars that specifically focuses on the common performance measures and how they relate to higher education. Another thing that VR counselors can do is get to know what college programs are available in their area. Use some of the resources that Deborah talked about. Go on thinkcollege.net. Find out what's nearby to you and visit those programs. Contact the staff so that you know what they're offering and which students it might be a good fit for. And then based on that information, just giving information to students on what those college options are and on how VR can support them, whether that's understanding what the policies are around supporting tuition, fees, and expenses, or other supports that students might be able to tap into, such as assistive technology or additional job coaching while they're in college. Okay, next slide. And so we'll move on to during college, and I'll hand it back to Deborah to talk a little bit more again about the family role and move on to the next slide.
One of the key areas to become familiar with is the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA. I hear all the time that parents are really surprised that about the requirements of this act. I think it's important from the get-go to establish a really concrete, clear communication process with program personnel. Many will have policies in place already, but you need to become aware of them. When students are in K-12, the FERPA really is more in support of parents' access to student records. That changes significantly when students enroll in college or turn 18 years old. Access to the student records must be granted by the student in writing. Many programs have a form, and one of the first things that they do is work with students on informing them to their rights, and that if students want to grant access to their student records, in particular their grades and or any activities or code of conduct violations would be in the student records. They must sign that form giving permission. Even if a student does do this, there are some colleges that won't just blanket, will not allow access to the student record no matter what. And it's good to identify that up front. Next slide, please. This is another insight brief about FERPA that will have much more information, but it really, I can't encourage you enough to really read this brief, get very familiar with what your rights are and what they're not, what it really protects in terms of this access to the student record. Next slide, please. Jen?
Okay, that's me again. So in terms of the roles that VR counselors and agencies can play during college, one is just making sure that students are connected with VR while they're in college. So I talked about the role of the VR counselor in referring students to a college program, but we also found in these sites that we looked at that a lot of students actually weren't even connected with VR before they went to college. So maybe they heard about the college program from word of mouth, other families, or from a teacher, and they went from high school or transition program into the college program, but they still weren't connected with VR. So figuring out a way to interact with that college program and get those students on board while they're in college is a good way of being set up for supporting their success beyond. As I said, connecting students with whatever financial and other supports VR can provide is also an important role. One of the VR supervisors that we talked about this tuition assistance as being so essential because it can be a game changer, she said, because it makes it no longer a rich kids club to go to college. So that's really an important thing to think about. Are there ways that VR can help students who don't have the private resources to go to college to connect with higher education? Counselors meeting with students regularly while they're in college is another good practice that we encountered. Sometimes they would actually work out a schedule with the college staff where they were meeting with each student around the time that they were registering for their courses, for example, so that they could make sure that the students were justifying what courses they might want VR to pay for and how they relate to their employment goals. So they were figuring out what kinds of supports or supplies or assistance they might need, and having VR really supporting them at the start of each semester or during the semester to see if any issues were coming up, and having a set agenda for what the counselor would meet with the student about at various times through the college year. And then just one of the most important things that we heard from both higher ed and VR staff is just the importance of ongoing communication, not just regular formal meetings between the college program that's collaborating with the local VR office, but just day-to-day communication and a sense of teamwork working on behalf of students, knowing the staff at the college well enough that they can pick up the phone and call you if there's a concern or a question, and vice versa. And we also have another seminar available that goes into more detail on those communication and coordination tips as well. So next slide. After college. I continue to take the lead on the after college part of the presentation because it really involves coordination between VR parents and the college to support students as they transition to adult life. So next slide, please. So as I said, it takes collaboration and teamwork to make that transition seamless. So what we heard really works for programs that are successfully collaborating with VR is to have some sort of a transition meeting really no later than the first semester of the final year of college, in which the VR counselor, the family members, the college staff, and anyone else who really has an important contribution to make meets to talk about what the student's vision is for their life beyond college and how they can be supported to attain that vision. And in that way, the goal is often to make sure that students are leaving college already set up for success in employment and moving towards that vision. Another important thing for both families and VR counselors to be thinking about is what are the students' ongoing support needs going to be and how will those be met? So certainly there's a role for VR, and often there is some sort of a handoff at the time the student completes college, in which the college employment support staff fade out their role and VR or another community rehabilitation provider funded by the VR agency takes over in a more adult support role. But then some students will also need supports on an ongoing basis beyond that. So thinking about whether the student might be eligible for services through the state Developmental Disabilities Agency is an important role for that. They can figure out whether the student qualifies for Medicaid waiver funding, which can support residential supports, day and employment services and supports. A lot of states have self-directed options for that Medicaid waiver funding. If that's what you choose to do, there are a lot of options, but making sure that the student is connected with that agency if that's appropriate and if those ongoing supports are needed can be a role both for the VR counselor and the family to be coordinating on. You also want to consider whether the student wants support for lifelong learning. Just having that option to go back and take more classes and continue to learn even after they've completed their formal 1-year, 2-year, 4-year program. And as I mentioned, thinking about the residential options, is the student going to live with family? Are they looking to live in an apartment? Will they need supports to live on their own if that's what their vision is? And thinking about how the family and or the DD agency and or friends and others can support that student's residential living. So next slide, please.
This is go ahead. This is a list of the resources I was referring to throughout the presentation with links to those different items. In addition to the PACER Center's website, Transition and Employment. Next slide, please. If you want to learn more about Think College, I would really encourage you to navigate the website. There's a lot of information targeted for different audiences, for students, for family members, for professionals. Or if you want some technical assistance, thinkcollegeta@gmail.com. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Vocational Rehabilitation Practices and Youth online seminar. Please follow the provided link to take the quiz. As a reminder, if you score 70% or more above, you will be emailed a certificate of completion. If you score below 70%, you'll have one more additional opportunity to re-watch the seminar and complete the quiz. Thank you.